Welcome to the Story Copywriter Podcast, the show that teaches you everything you need to know to write stories that sell and become the written voice of a business you love. With me, your host and founder of Story Copywriters, Rob Drummond. Okay, so we've got a repeat guest here on the Story Copywriter Podcast. So James Daniel's been on the show before. James is a direct response copywriter, very experienced, been in the industry a long time, but also has great insights and is a storytelling expert. So I thought, well, let's have James back on the show to talk more specifically about the art of business storytelling, and in particular, finding valuable lessons in your own life stories. So James, welcome back.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be here. I'm going to get my own parking space soon, I think.
Yeah. That's fine. There's plenty of parking spaces available.
Yeah.
Perhaps for anyone listening who isn't familiar with you, maybe you could just talk through a slice of who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So I mean, basically, I've been a jobbing writer for 35 years now. Before I was a copywriter, I was a script writer for TV, radio, wrote for press and computer games and so on. So story was always my first fascination. So when I trained as a copywriter in 2005, story was always the first thing that drew me to any client situation. So I would always look to find a story rather than just talking at them about sort of, here's your problem, here's your solution. If we can find the story, because as you know, story always primes the customer's mind. It gets them in the right mode of thinking about something. And we're programmed for stories, and the old cliche about how it switches on that movie projector in your mind, the same as when you get lost in a book. So it's something that has always fascinated me. I'm fascinated by the mechanics of story, by the 3-act structure that takes somebody, as the Greek said, in Act 1, you chase your character up a tree. In Act 2, you throw rocks at him, and in Act 3, he finds his way down. That's always fascinated me. And I've trained with some of the screenwriting gurus to sort of really get inside that. As a result, as I started to develop as a copywriter, I started to look at what kind of stories other people were telling, and to sort of develop my own kind of template as to where you can find stories in your own life and that sort of thing. So it's just something that has fascinated me my entire life.
It's a very human thing, isn't it? I think what's interesting to me is that all humans throughout the entire written record, as far as we're aware of, and even the verbal record of indigenous cultures, it's all the same thing, and you see the same echoes showing up over and over. So there has to be something that's important in that.
Yeah, exactly. And you see the results of it are there to see every single time. Every time that I test 2 bits of copy, the story always wins. If I've been along, back in the days when I was networking, where most people will stand up and give their pitch saying, I can do this for you, blah, blah, blah. And if I stand up and sort of tell a story, then you can actually see light bulbs going on, switching on in somebody's mind. It's a very obvious and very sort of, very apparent sort of benefit to it. So I mean, I could talk all day about stories and about the similarities. You've probably seen me talk previously about how my pet thing is how every story is the 3 billy goats gruff. Where basically you need the elements of you need trolls. You need a troll, you need some goats, you need some grass and a bridge for them to go over. And basically, as long as you've got those elements in place,
My kids keep insisting that we read 3 billy goats gruff at bedtime, and part of me is a little bit sick of it, and part of me acknowledges that it is an archetypal story, so I shouldn't maybe complain too much.
It's the universal story, I think. Because you've got to have that green grass that they're aiming for, and so on. And you know, my other bugbear is that, you know, like The Wizard of Oz and Back to the Future are the same story. You know, you know, it's I just love sort of analysing these
It's
things.
just dressed up in different themes, but it's the same thing underneath.
You've got a kid who's sort of disaffected, who, you know, goes off into another universe, finds their way home, and appreciates their environment, and then they get back. You know, it's the same story. You know.
That's what Christopher Booker wrote about in the 7 Basic
Yeah.
Plots, was that you've only got so many themes here that are all dressed up in different ways.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I talk about this a lot, you know, in sort of training seminars, and, you know, I've occasionally sort of done, you know, after dinner talks about the whole story thing. And what I tend to use is one particular thing, one particular event from my life. And it's quite a big story, so it's a bigger story than you might use in, for example, an email or something like that. But the reason I use it for illustration is because it has so many permutations. You know, the idea being, you know, you tell a story and it automatically leads to some kind of lesson. You know, so I'll quickly tell you this story if that's okay.
Please do.
I won't sort of give you the big elaborate sort of Peter Ustinov style anecdote of it here, but basically it comes from a time when I was a student in London. I was working in the West End in the theatres, and I spent 3 years working on the Andrew Lloyd Webber show Starlight Express. Now, you probably have heard the show was performed entirely on roller skates, and the whole theatre was converted into a giant roller skating track. So the track looped around the back of the stalls, up around the front of the circle. You know, the stage was like a bowl where you sort of, you know, the skaters could just sort of, like you're sitting in the inside of a bowl. So you sort of go around. It's quite perilous. And then there's a bit that juts out from the stage like a sort of horseshoe, so that, you know, that loops around a section of the audience. So it was at the time probably the best roller skating track in the world, and it was built for expert skaters. It wasn't built for the likes of me. Long story short, I ended up doing the stage door overnight shift where somebody had to be in there sort of looking after the theatre. Most of the people working there were out of work actors and dancers and all itching to have a go on the stage, but they were trained roller skaters. And so, you know, I got talked into letting a couple of them in. One of them said to me, "Oh, you should put some skate, you know, grab some skates from downstairs, have a go with us." I thought, "Well, you know what you're doing. I don't." You know, he said, "It's fine. Don't worry. I'll hold on to you. You go first, and I'll sort of go behind you, and I'll hold on to you." And just as we're coming to the most dangerous bit of the track, he says, "You'll be fine," and pushes me. Not just lets go, but actually pushes me. Yeah. So what happens? I'm coming onto the stage around this bowl section, and I'm on one wheel. And now, just to put this in context, this part of the set has written off the careers of highly skilled, highly trained skaters in the past. Yeah. You know, people who'd gone flying into the back wall when they tried to do their stunt there. One wheel, and I'm not joking, but I made it. I actually sort of came round it somehow. I survived, and I landed on the stage. Actually, you know, I'm still on on both feet, on 8 wheels. Landed on the stage. I think, wow, I'm still alive. But I am now shooting down that section that goes out, that loops around the audience, that sort of U-bend section. And that is really sharp. There is an incredibly sharp bend there. And there's no way that a skater of my skill or lack of it can take that bend. You know, I mean, even the skilled skaters in the cast, they had a perspex barrier that would go up when they were skating around there at speed. It would go up and down, you know, motorized. But this is nighttime, and the barrier's down, you know. And this is that thing in your, you know, when you go, you know, when you realize there is no good option here, you know. And I had to sort of evaluate, well, if I try to take this bend, the chances are, because it's sort of, you know, it's raised as you try to go around it, the chances are I'm just going to shoot off and land at the back of the stalls. If I make it around the bend, there's a stairway that crosses it, and I'm going to sort of land on the sort of the banister that crosses it, big metal pole, and I'm going to sort of squish some organs. If I manage to get past that, I'm going to go flying into the adjacent wall. There is no good outcome here at all. So in the end, I decided I'm going to have to jump. I'm going to have to actually jump off the track before I hit the bend. And I did that. I landed in what was, I think, Q13 of the stalls. Yeah. If you go to see Wicked in London, which is at the same theatre now, if you sit in Q13, there's a good chance that you'll find a dent underneath your seat the shape of my head. 30 odd years ago, but it's possible. So anyway, I landed there, and I was actually concussed for a minute or two. Woke up and with everybody, instead of being concerned, just going, ha ha ha, James nearly died, you know. And that's I tell this story with sort of great aplomb when I sort of train on it or whatever. But the reason that I think that it's worth sharing here is that it has a lot of natural consequences. So it you know, as I say, there's a lesson in every story. In this one, there are 7 or 8. You know, so for example, you know, the big one is about knowing your own limitations. You know, it's about the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you like. You know, I'd skated once, you know, at a roller disco in Caerphilly when I was 15, and thought, oh yeah, I'll be fine.
I can do this. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a big lesson there that I could tell the story and then say, so let's talk about knowing your own limitations. Or there's something about responding to peer pressure. Yeah, it's the only time in my life I've ever given into peer pressure. But you know, you could draw a lesson about sort of how to resist it, how to stand your ground and know that it's a bad idea. Or you could talk about taking split-second decisions. You know, about evaluating all of your options instantly and then committing to an action.
There's various off-ramps from the story, isn't there? There's various things that it could be illustrating.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, it's the idea of it is the story primes your mind, gets you ready for the juicy information or the helpful information that follows, in a way that just giving the information simply won't. You know, if we just sat down and said, let me tell you about how to know your own limitations. First of all, understand, you know,
I'm already bored.
Yeah,
and you've already said about 4 words. So,
but because your mind is now switched on to this, you are receptive to the lesson that follows. And I think, you know, for me, that's a fascinating thing, you know.
I'd just like to throw something at you. So I think a lot of people are trying to find the perfect story to match the message. And
Yes.
I don't think it's actually necessary, because each story actually has a sort of versatile number of applications. I'm more often trying to get people to identify interesting stories and then find some kind of off-ramp in the story where you can make this connection.
Yeah, and I mean, I always say that you can do it either way. You know, if there's a point that you want to make, you can usually sort of reverse engineer that and find a story that will lead into it. If not from your own life, then, you know, you can even create your own sort of fables, you know. But usually it's better to just find the stories in your own life, because there are always lessons that you can draw from. So to take the reverse process, I wanted to write, when I was writing emails for a marketing agency a few years ago, I wanted to write something about not trying to do everything yourself and bringing in an expert. And I thought anything from real life in that is going to sound too sort of like, you know, hey, I'm the big I am. Yeah, too boastful. So I wrote a sort of parable instead, which was a story about a farmer who had problems with mice eating his grain. So he built a very elaborate mousetrap. You know, he spent forever doing it, and, you know, caught a couple of mice and celebrated that. But meantime, all the mice he didn't catch had eaten his grain, and he was now going out of business. He spoke to the farmer from the next farm. You know, well, how did you get around this? He said, I bought a cat. You know, and the lesson that comes out of it is, you know, look, some people are naturally disposed to help you. You know, somebody has a natural disposition, just bring them in. Don't try and sort of fake it to do what is not you, you know, what you're not naturally aligned to. And I think that worked there to sort of, you know, to start with the lesson that you want to draw and create the story to match it. But usually I think you'll find the best stories by looking into your own life. Because there are always lessons you can draw from it, particularly if you're in any business that helps people to grow their business or to grow themselves. So if you're a coach, a life coach or a business coach, if you're a marketing consultant, a copywriter, anybody who helps people line their pocket or live a better life, then those fields lend themselves to those kind of metaphors where you can tell a story that is completely unrelated and still find a parallel.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to explore this idea of story selection a bit more, because I think one of the things that comes up in storytelling circles is to kind of really understand the customer and try to find overlaps between your story and their story. So you have this kind of Venn diagram. I've always been a little bit suspicious of it, because actually I've never been skating as such. I've never been involved in the theatre. I do not sit in that Venn diagram. However, listening to your story was very engaging, and it evoked it caused other stories to kind of bubble up to the surface that weren't necessarily directly related at the time. Of times when, those off ramps are equivalent. So it's been about snap second decisions, or it's been about situations where I've put myself in, a lot of peril.
Mm.
And I just wonder what you thought about that. Like, do you kind of go down the road of thinking about, well, who is the customer avatar and what's going to kind of resonate with them, or are you just trying to tell interesting stories that will be in their frame of reference?
I think it starts with, if they're the right readers for you, then there is a degree of affinity there between your life and theirs. And I think it's largely in the telling as well, in the sort of the style of how you tell the story. But I think that a story that has a human sort of backbone to it, if you like, is interesting regardless.
Mm.
And of course, it varies from industry to industry. I mean, something that really annoys me is when sort of self-appointed gurus in particular will say, look, every business is different. Look, buy my email course. Every single business should be sending daily emails. It's rubbish. There are people we don't want to hear from. You don't need to hear from a locksmith every day, because that's demand driven. You'll call them when you need them, when you're locked out of your house, as long as you can see that they've got the necessary credentials, you will trust them. You don't need to have heard from them. And there are other people you just don't want in your life. And I think we've talked about this before. You don't want your local funeral director, popping up in your inbox saying, let me tell you about that time that I got locked out and lost all my clothes at the hotel. By the way, you're going to die soon.
No.
You don't want
It's not the use case for it.
No, it always depends on the
Are you providing a transformation, a personal transformation, and that really lends itself to it, I think.
Yeah, it is. And also, is it a case of you can add value to people long before they actually need you, and you build that kind of slow burn relationship. I think that's where stories really come into their own. It doesn't work for every business, but it works for an awful lot, particularly coaches, consultants, I'd say.
Yeah. As you were telling me your skating story, I was actually thinking about playing rugby. And I went to a grammar school, so we kind of got roped into playing rugby. I realized about 4 years too late that it was actually optional. I could have just, said, no, thanks, I'll do cross country or something less violence instead. But I ended up playing rugby. And then because I was quite fast, you end up playing for the school team. And then the higher up you go in the rugby ladder, eventually you come across someone who's bigger than you, faster than you. You're going to get your face sort of pushed into the mud, maybe break a few bones. And that was a story that came to me. And it's like, well, that story doesn't necessarily overlap that much with my clients, especially if I'm writing to someone in the US. But it's not really about the rugby. It's about if I was writing it, I would write about the experience of being on the pitch and facing this number 14 that's opposite me, that's eyeballing me. He's looking at me saying, I'm going to get you. And he did.
Yeah. But there are always parallels, because it's a human story. It's ultimately a story about fear and about perhaps, getting in out of your depth, and the parallels in there are very sort of rich, in terms of, look, you probably came into that match filled with confidence because you'd come up through the system, you'd been playing for your school for a while, and then all of a sudden something happens that makes you completely doubt yourself. And how do you cope in that moment? So, the parallel is immediate.
Yeah, the lessons are universal. The specifics are, the specifics are specific to that circumstance, that sport, but the lessons of it are universal. Yeah, that's great. So in terms of people finding valuable lessons in their own life stories, is it worth almost trying to take an inventory of your own life stories?
I think it is, yeah. I mean, where I started was I started breaking my life down into chunks, and I think your school days are only sort of so interesting, because obviously it's not adult life. you'll have a couple of formative sort of moments, the defining moment of your childhood. Mine was taking a hat trick in a school's cricket competition, for example, and there's a lot I can get out of that. It was it was 45 years ago, and I still brag about it.
And you're still talking about it now. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you've got those few moments. You've got moments of disappointment and moments of of optimism that get dashed. But I think really where your life gets interesting to an adult audience is probably when you go off to college. So what I did, I started breaking my life down in terms of, okay, so there's, it's all compartmentalized. There's my time at uni, there's my early jobs, the different things that I did, freelancing and so on. Then each job that you've had, all the relationships that you've had, all your friendship circles, your most exciting experiences that you've had. So you sort of just break everything down. And I think, your work life is a thing in itself. But it's not, think about all the people that you've worked with, all the worst bosses that you've had, all the sort of the triumphs and the disasters. But remember, it's not just about all the things that have happened to you. It's the things that have happened to other people that you've worked with, and it's about the way that has shaped your mind. It's about the values that you've evolved along the way. It's about the expertise, the knowledge that you've amassed. And what I always say is, if you use this approach, you'll be writing emails that no other person on the planet can write, because there is nobody who has your unique
lived experience,
Venn diagram, who has your unique mix of knowledge, values, and experience. Nobody. And if you use that properly, you can not only sort of be unique, but you can be authentic. You can make a much stronger connection with your target audience, with your readership, because you are letting them into your world.
I think every story potentially contains valuable lessons if you look for them.
Yeah.
I think that when I'm interviewing a client, I do a similar thing where I will explore each compartment separately. And I think what I'm really looking for is, how does the story make me feel? Does it make me feel something? And it's often to do with challenge and personal growth and things like that, that actually those things catch my attention more than the obvious stories that are more obviously relatable to the message. I'm less concerned about that, I think.
Yeah, I kind of get bored by stories that have a sort of a direct,
that are expected.
Yes, that have a direct thing. I mean, this is one of my disappointments with LinkedIn, is that people don't really tell stories on there. People just get straight to the value, to the message. Or if they do tell a story, then there's no sort of no parable in there. It's just sort of, let me tell you about something I did for a client and this is what happened, rather than sort of getting to know them. And I think that's a real opportunity lost in the way that we behave on LinkedIn, because we're connected, all of us, to hundreds, thousands of people. We accept connections from people we don't actually know. This storytelling approach would be a perfect way for us all to get to know each other.
And I think once you're connected with someone on LinkedIn, I think that's good enough permission to share some more personal stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would like to see this stuff more on people's walls, rather than, here's my 5 handy tips on how to do this, on how to solve this particular problem. Tell the story, reveal your personality, then give your value at the end.
I mean, you could still do both. You could still have the 5 tips. You could preface it with a personal example of.
Absolutely, yeah. No, the 5 tips are great. But what we're getting is just the cold information at the minute, and that I find is an opportunity lost. And I know everybody's busy. Nobody sort of goes on LinkedIn sort of looking to sort of I wonder if there's a good anecdote from so and so today. But I don't know. I think the platform would be a much richer experience for all if there was a bit of a mix where more people were willing to tell those kind of stories.
I have a few connections who are telling more personal stories, and I think it's telling that I go on LinkedIn to get stuff done, either to message someone or to connect with someone, but then I get distracted by someone who's actually being authentic and telling their story.
Yeah. I've tried it a few times. I've generally found that engagement is lower when you do it, but I think that's because of the culture on LinkedIn. A few times I've actually just pasted in a couple of my most successful emails, just to see how they perform. And these are emails that, you know, I know have worked as emails. I know that they've been, you know, well, they've actually brought in business as well as bringing in sort of wow, love this kind of comments and so on. But in LinkedIn, it's a different environment, and you know, you get a bit of tumbleweed with it, you know.
Yeah, and I always wonder, like, if you put out a post, like how many of your connections are actually seeing it? Because I think LinkedIn probably curates who it shows people. I think it probably, I don't know this for definite, but I think it only shows it to people who LinkedIn thinks will be interested in it based on your recent interaction with them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And that's, you know, that in itself is sort of makes things difficult, because you know, you can go to great lengths crafting a perfect LinkedIn post. You know, I put up a carousel of some different, you know, bits of advice last week, which took me several hours to put together, and it didn't seem to sort of even get displayed that much.
Mm.
It's quite frustrating, but yeah, I would just like to see it become a more human environment in that way, with some more stories, and you know, so we can get to know each other. And
Less bragging, more authenticity.
yeah, I hate the bragging. I
Mm.
really hate the sort of the chest beating, you know.
Mm.
Yeah, but yeah, I think to come back to your original question, you know, I think that you can analyze every aspect of your life, and find these stories, and also, you know, stories can get you out of a hole, you know, in any kind of situation. We were talking just before we came on air with this, about my instant eulogy. I think is a nice example. Probably the best sort of way that a story has saved me. But several years ago, I come from a very big family, okay, and or it was a big family. Everyone's dying now, but I've kind of by default become the go-to person to do eulogies at family funerals.
That's interesting, because so have I. I
It happened
spoke
to
at
you,
both of my
yeah.
grandparents' funerals within a few months of each other, and I just told stories because, well, that's the least I can do.
Yeah, it's all you can do, and I quite enjoy doing it, because I think that every life should be marked with a tribute, you know, and I find it very sad when I go to a funeral and see that, you know,
And it's all a
nobody's
bit
saying,
dry and functional. Yeah.
yeah, I
Mm.
don't like that, you know. So you know, it's always been, you know, somebody dies, oh, James will do it, and I don't mind as long as they ask me in advance. But when my auntie Joan died about 5 years ago, she was the last of my dad's brothers and sisters. I'd been away at a conference in America and just got back a few hours before the funeral, so I'm jet lagged, sitting there, and the priest says, "And now James is going to say a few words."
That's a tough gig.
He knows me from other funerals, you know, and he's looking
Mm.
straight at me, and I'm looking around going, well, is there another James in the family? I don't know. No, it's you. You know, and my auntie had 2 children of her own, you know, so it wasn't like I was the only option. Anyway, they said, yeah, sorry, we didn't ask you. Can you do it? So seconds later, I'm standing at the lectern thinking, okay, use this principle, tell a story, draw a lesson from it, and get off the stage. You know, just,
Correct.
you know. So literally the first story that came to mind was the most innocuous and most sort of kind of banal thing that you could possibly come up with. The story, basically, my auntie was a cleaner, and a few years earlier, she had helped my dad to get to clean this big old metal bathtub, you know, because my dad just couldn't get it clean no matter what. And she said, oh, okay, you know, hold my beer, you know, I'll do it. Brought up all her best cleaning materials, stayed with the problem until it was done, you know, just talked about that and said, because that's who she was, because she would do anything for her family. And, you know, she would never give up on anything, you know. So there are sort of lessons to come out of this, and I'm just pulling this stuff out of my ass, you know. But you know, it was just a way then that led nicely into a sort of a quick spontaneous tribute, as a way of saying, so yeah, so there we are, so God bless her, and sort of got off the stage. But you know, I think that's the beauty of stories, that it doesn't have to be, you know, you don't have to tell Gone with the Wind or anything as elaborate as the skating story I was
It can
telling
be
you.
anecdotal.
Yeah, it could be very, very simple, a tiny slice of life that feels so irrelevant it's barely worth telling until you draw the lesson from it, and then you realize that the whole thing has value.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, the story that I told about, so I did the same thing for my grandparents, and I think when my granddad died, I told a story about, like, we used to go and watch a lot of rugby games. So I obviously played rugby at school, and he would be there on the sidelines watching with this like worried expression as I was having my face driven into the mud by some by some massive winger. But then we used to go and watch rugby as well, and it was on the way to one of these rugby games that I mentioned that Tranmere Rovers was the football team that I supported that had made it to the League Cup final at Wembley, and I didn't think I'd get a ticket, but kind of left it at that. And then anyway, the tickets came around on general sale, and it then transpired the next day that my granddad had gone and camped outside Princeton Park, which is the home ground of the Tranmere Rovers, with about 20 other people, sat there all night to be first in the queue to get tickets to go and watch Tranmere play at Wembley. So we went down to Wembley, we watched Tranmere lose to Leicester City, and then I eventually managed to thank him. So the next year, Tranmere played Everton in the FA Cup, and we were 2-0 up at half time. And as he was the only Everton fan I could think of to call, I rang him just to make sure he'd seen the score.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of like things that you could tell about that. It was dedication. It was doing anything for someone. It was going above and beyond, because I just mentioned this on the way to a rugby game, and then all of a sudden we're off doing this, and
and without asking for gratitude,
I didn't ask for it.
Deal of the fact that he'd camped out overnight, that you had to find that out, and there's something about humility in that. Yeah. I mean, that's a much better story than mine with the bathtub. But
I was thinking of starting a side business called Rent a Grandson, where if you need someone at your funeral to share a few stories, a few anecdotes, then I pop up on stage and
it's not a bad idea. I have actually been thinking.
The side businesses of Rent a Best Man. There's a whole range of options there. But
I've been thinking of writing the definitive book on putting together your eulogy and so on, but it's about number 25 on my list of projects I might get to at some point.
Maybe one day.
Yeah.
You mentioned before the call about the Superman story being one option for telling your story, and particularly in regards to your about page. And I wondered if you could just talk through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think, in a typical story, you have a main character who goes through some kind of transformation. But there is a kind of character who initiates the transformation, but doesn't actually change themselves. And Superman is an example of that, as is Mary Poppins, as is James Bond. They go into other people's lives, they affect change, but remain constant. And what I find is that is a very useful device for case studies and about pages. About pages in particular, because about pages should be the best part of any website, but they're usually the worst. They are the definitive opportunity missed, because it's typically, we are passionate about this, or we've been in business since 1836, so you can trust us, or all of this rubbish. While if they actually told stories where they talk about the difference that they make in customers' lives, then you could do something. What I always say to people is, start with the story of how you helped an Uber client. Who is your typical sort of everyman client? What was their problem? How did you go in and solve it? How did that change their life, in the classic sort of transformational case study format? But you talk about it in a narrative way, and you don't formally structure it like a case study saying the client, the problem, etc. It's just a narrative, and the focus is on them. You're kind of incidental in the story. You are Mary Poppins. The story of Mary Poppins, the main character is Mr. Banks, not Mary Poppins. Yeah. So your client is Mr. Banks, and you are Mary Poppins, and you are focusing on them, on the problems that they faced, and how their life is better as a result. It's the classic sort of irony that your about page is not actually about you at all. So you start by telling that story, and from there you move into a reflection of this is the kind of way that we work with our clients, the kind of help that we deliver. We do it. You can then sort of expand a little bit on your method and the types of people you can help, the types of people you can't help, etc. But it's that initial story that makes that connection and gets them thinking. First of all, warms them to you personally, and also switches them onto the right way of thinking as to whether they're an appropriate prospect for you. So I think that's always a very effective approach for that kind of page.
I think Superman's an interesting word for it, because when you're in the zone doing what you do best, you look like Superman.
Yes.
I think because we all undervalue our skills, and we all it's just doing what you do it on a normal day at the office. But for the person who really needs your help, you doing that, and it might only take you 5 minutes, but you look like Superman in that moment. So you get to play Superman.
Yeah.
And then tell a story about how you swooped into this situation and made something very difficult look very easy, because that's the definition of being a professional.
Exactly. And then you fly off asking for no credit, and just sort of saying, well, glad to be of service, and go off and change somebody else's life.
Yeah, perfect.
And you can do that in a way where, with implied modesty. And I think that that's really important, because we were saying earlier about the kind of the bragging that happens on LinkedIn. You can talk about what you've done and how you've changed somebody's life without the chest beating. You can allow people to draw their own conclusion in terms of, wow, this person has done something special there. To the point where, and this is probably because I've been conditioned to not to brag my entire life, from a very early age, but to the point where I will sometimes even write in the account of what I've done for a client in the passive. In passive wording rather than active, so that it's sort of then this was done and this was done, so that I'm not seen to be going, hey, look at me, I'm the big I am. That might mean that might be a sign that I need therapy or something. But I think sometimes there is an argument for that. If your copy is feeling a little boastful, then switching from active to passive sometimes can be a way of toning it down a little. Not that you want to sort of dismiss the credit that you're due, but that sometimes it can make you look a little bit less conceited.
I think people obviously don't blow their own trumpet enough, and obviously you need to blow your own trumpet a bit, but I think it's also quite comforting to make it about somebody else that isn't just you talking about you. I think it's probably the easiest way to blow your own trumpet, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And through testimonials, what somebody else says about you is far more useful. But I was commenting on somebody's post on this a couple of hours ago about a few years ago I was top of Google for the phrase expert copywriter, which was quite a nice gig to have, to sort of be at the top for that. I would not claim to be the world's leading expert copywriter or necessarily even the top one in this street, but for some reason I was there. What happened was I saw that I was beginning to rank from a testimonial that had dropped in from a client who said James is an expert copywriter. So because there's no way I was going to say, hey, look at me, I'm an expert, so because then you sound like Theresa May going, look, we're strong and stable, and people just don't warm to that kind of self.
But if it's someone else saying it,
yeah, exactly,
that's okay.
So if you can use a client's testimonial as your main headline and put that in there, then all of a sudden it's there, but it's not you, and that was quite effective. In the end, I actually found the ranking was worth a lot less than I expected it to be, so I kind of moved in a different direction. But it's very valuable to sort of use somebody else's words for those moments that where bragging needs to come in.
Do you have any other comments on gathering good, engaging testimonials? So, for instance, something that I do in mine is, firstly, I don't gather them. I ask my virtual assistant to gather them, because people will tell him things that they won't necessarily tell me.
Yeah.
I also then ask him so he will ask people, what was the situation before? What were you worried about before? What might have stopped you from hiring James?
Yeah.
And then what did you find? So you get this kind of before and after thing, because then the before, I was worried about this, that relates well with people who are also researching potentially, I think.
Yes. Yeah, it
I just
does. I
wondered
mean,
if you had any thoughts of ways to gather, because otherwise testimonials are it can be a bit like eating a packet of Skittles, like it's overly sweet. I'm like, well, where is the challenge? Where is the
yeah.
other side of it?
Yes, exactly. I mean, to be honest, I think you've just summed up my entire approach to it, which is, get somebody else to do it and, say to them, look, I'm not looking for James is really, really good, honest. I'm looking for, talk about the challenge that you had, talk about your hesitation, talk about sort of, why you realized that your fears were unfounded. It's everything that you just said. But I think that, again, it's the story thing. It's the case study approach of sort of, problem and transformation. I think that once you can train a client in terms of, look, this is what makes a good case study, a case study type testimonial. I think that suddenly that tends to switch on a light with a lot of clients. As soon as they realize that's the way to do it, then I've found that very good testimonials come back as a result.
This has been great, James. Is there anything else we should talk about before we sign off in regards to finding valuable lessons in your own stories?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. So I think it's just about being willing to take the time to mine your life, to mine your experiences, and
This is the big problem, is that we don't do it because it feels like it isn't work. So we don't give ourselves permission to go to the cafe and spend a few hours exploring it, because you feel like, because your brain goes, I'm not being productive. I should be doing work that generates income or responding to emails or whatever.
Exactly. And to be honest, it can feel a bit self-indulgent as well. Like you're sort of thinking, what there's that little voice inside you thinking, well, why should anybody be interested in the time that this happened? When but as people get to know you through email, they do start to take an interest in your life, and you have to keep reminding yourself that the story is just the sort of the first part of the piece, and it's always about what's the lesson that spills out. You have to, if it's feeling like this is a futile exercise, this is this is a little bit too, let's say, self-indulgent, you have to keep reminding yourself of that. But it's definitely worth doing it, even if you set aside an entire day, just to sort of mine your whole life. You would be amazed. I would say most people would be able to come up with a year's worth of stories, even for daily emails. You could come up with 2, 3, 400 stories from different parts of your life if you really start and think about it.
I've been finding with clients, it's most productive to do it in stages. So we'll do like an hour's interview up front where we'll identify sort of 10 to 15 stories. They then go implement those, create some social posts. So LinkedIn is a good sounding ground for testing out some stories. And it might be that it's not a huge leap to convert a LinkedIn post into an email. So we do a bit of work, they get some feedback. That feedback validates the importance of continuing with the process, and then you kind of carry on. I think that kind of approach is maybe a bit easier to implement than saying, take a day off and come up with 200 story ideas.
I mean, I think it's different for everybody. That's how I did it. But then,
I'm more in your camp, but with clients, I found that there's slowly approaches.
I think so. Yeah. I'm a bit OCD about this stuff. And once I get my teeth into something, then, you can't stop me, but it's got enough momentum. I mean, in this guide that I put together on developing your own stories, Email Infinity, there's an accompanying 7-day course that says, go through over the next 7 days, work through this, and let's put together enough stories for the year. And it breaks it down day by day, saying, okay, so today we've been talking about how to mine your work life. Today we've been talking about sort of your formative years and so on. So you do it bit by bit, and just sort of initially all you're looking for is that sort of brain dump of that story will work, and then you can start to tie individual stories to individual lessons later on. There's a pairing process where it's like you've got 2 columns of data. In column 1 you've got your stories, column 2 you've got lessons that you want to draw. You see where they match up, okay, that lesson works nicely with that story. And sometimes you'll find you've got a story with no lesson, you'll find it. Sometimes you've got a lesson with no story, you'll invent it, you know.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I see people doing is judging stories as you're brainstorming them. And I think that's a mistake. I think you need to collate them all first and maybe even let them sit for, because there might be a lesson in it that just emerges through your subconscious brain at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they do say that the worst time to be creative is when you're sitting down, facing a blank page, that you come up with your best ideas when you're in the shower or mowing the lawn or emptying the dishwasher, you know.
That's when the inner muse is most active.
Yeah, exactly. Or like I say, 4 o'clock in the morning when you can't sleep, or, you know, yeah, exactly. So I have a kind of a rule that I apply ruthlessly, which is the moment an idea comes to me, unless I'm on a deadline, I have to stop and write it. Yeah, and it'll only be a first draft. You know, it might be that I give it 10 minutes just to get the idea down, and then it'll go into my file of, develop this. But the idea will never be as ripe as in that moment when you first have it. Doesn't mean you should fire it off straight away and let people see it, but get it there, lock it down so you know what it is, so it's something you can revisit in the future.
Yeah, I'm always trying to get my students to do this, is to store it as soon as it comes up. Try to organize it so you can actually retrieve it, because people make notes and then it's not in a format where you can actually dig it up again. It's just in a big notepad or something. It's like, well, that's also no good, which is a reason to do it electronically, ideally, because you could then search for it or tag it in some way.
Yeah. I mean, what I've started to do is to actually build everything into a spreadsheet, so I can sort of, okay, it's got this tag, it's on this subtopic, and and so on. This is about this bit of my life, and it relates to this kind of lesson. But for years, I was very, very disorganized. I didn't have a system for sort of finding stories, and I certainly didn't have a decent system for archiving my ideas. It was just, post-it notes here and there, a couple of notes on my phone, a few things on a spreadsheet I haven't opened in 5 years. You have to sort of take that time to get disciplined and pull it all together.
And this is why people get writer's block. It's not because it's just storing the ideas. It's observing them to begin with, and that, I think, is a separate skill that can be nurtured, but then it's also storing them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I also try to have at least a day between having the idea and publishing the idea out into the world, or like drafting an email and sending an email.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always pan out because of deadlines or whatever, but I try to have a gap.
I think I hate sending in copy to a client on the day of a deadline, or writing it on the day of a deadline, rather. And if it's something I'm sending out to my own list, the idea, you lose judgment when you're in that process, and you can think that what you've written is brilliant, and the idea can be sort of, if you like, it's half out of your head and half stuck in there. You need that perspective, that removal and distance wherever possible.
I've had enough very demanding clients to be able to fudge it, but I do not recommend that people try to do that. I think it's better to draft it, leave it to cool off for a day, revisit it, because it might be in the heat of the moment that you think that Shakespeare himself couldn't have penned a better story, and the temptation is to send it there and then, and you look back at it the next day and it's like, oh no, did I write that left-handed, or like,
Yeah, exactly. That kind of perspective is really vital. Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned email infinity. I wondered if you could share more details about that.
Yeah, so it's a guide I put together, which has, I think it's 125 different ways that you can come up with stories. So the idea of it is most of those ideas are repeatable. So like one of my favorite ones is your annoying coworker. So it's sort of in the category of your work life, and it's sort of somebody who really annoyed you at work, and you can just have a bit of a rant with that. And I got a very satisfying email out of that one, for example, talking about, there was this guy used to sit near me in my corporate life who had Tourette's, and every hour he would shout out the word herringbone. And he would do it in a really sort of creepy voice as well. He'd just herringbone, and his co-workers, they loved it. It was sort of, they found it funny. The problem is that I had a different job from everybody that sat in that area. Yeah, so my job was business development, and I was on the phone MDs and
There's a new prospect.
yeah. And all of a sudden somebody's sort of in my ear going, Errington. It got to a point where I was timing it, because I thought, okay, he's done one now, I'm probably clear for another hour, I can get on the phone. So that was a lovely sort of thing for a story. And basically it's got all these things of the obvious stuff, like the worst day of your life and things like that, and the idea of it is that if you need to write something, fire off a story to your list, you can just dip into it. You could go to a random number generator and go, okay, 77, what is it? And there you go. You may have used it before, but you can probably find another one version on it. Yeah. And I think that you should be able to use that to write emails potentially every day for the rest of your life. I'm not saying that it's absolutely definitive, because I'm sure that there are ways that I've missed out of it, but these are ways that have worked for me, and also from emails that I've analyzed that have come from, whether it's sort of high profile email marketers, or from people with smaller lists who I just happen to admire as writers, not necessarily even copywriters, just anybody who sends out interesting emails. I've said, okay, well, yeah, that's the kind of story that they're telling in this email, and that will go into the list. It's the product of about 5 years worth of analysis. So I think for anybody who is committed to storytelling, who sends out regular emails, or you could use it for social media posts or blog posts, I think it's an invaluable resource.
Where can people find that?
If you go to jamesthecopywriter.co.uk /email-infinity, you can download it free of charge.
Okay, perfect. I will make sure that
or anything, and you get a free implementation course with it as well.
Okay, I will make sure that link is in the notes with the episode.
Fantastic.
Great. Well, this has been great, James. Thanks so much for coming on, as always, and I'll keep your parking space reserved out front for the next call.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, James. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Story Copywriter Podcast, you'll want to make sure you're on my email list. When you sign up at storycopywriters.com/podcast, I'll also send you my 7-day storytelling crash course free by email. Please also make sure you've got a copy of my simple story selling book, which is available from Amazon in paperback and Kindle formats. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.